Joining me now in the studio is James D. Boyce, who is, of course, a political historian and expert in US politics. He's visiting the University of Warwick Pace Department this afternoon to give a lecture ahead of his new book. James, how are you?
I'm very well. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Hey, thank you very much for coming on. Obviously, a lot to cover in terms of US politics and in particular US foreign policy. But I think we'll start off firstly from the beginning of the Trump era. It's nearly a year since, of course, Trump was elected President of the United States. How do you assess his performance so far?
Not good, to put it mildly. I think there was an expectation in some certain optimistic areas that he would become presidential and rise to the occasion. When you consider the amount of Republican senators who are throwing their hands up in the air and resigning effectively and deciding not to run again because they're so appalled by Trump's behavior, a president of his own party, and when they're the only people who feel free to be able to speak candidly, then we really are in a world of pain, quite frankly. Donald Trump, I think, is living in his own little dream world with regards to the tweets he puts out, talking about being more successful and getting more stuff done than any president in history. I would suggest he needs to study some of the work of Robert Caro, looking at Lyndon Johnson and the historic presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt, to talk about historic administrations and what they've achieved under far more difficult opportunistic situations.
So you mentioned his Twitter then, and obviously you're giving a lecture to Pace about foreign policy later. Does his Twitter have any impact on international relations, would you say?
Yes, it does. It alters drastically how the country is being seen, how his administration is being perceived. I'm not quite sure whether he realises, quite frankly, how influential they are. He is in a war of words with the leader of North Korea, something which would not be countenanced under most circumstances. And in so doing, he actually elevates Kim Jong-un to the same level as the American president. You know, there is many warnings about not getting into a fight in the dirt with pigs. You get down to their level. In this case, Trump is elevating Kim Jong-un to the same level as the American presidency, and that really is more than unfortunate. And
obviously his opponent in the election, Hillary Clinton, has been quite vocal recently. She's come to the UK because she's got her new book coming out. I mean, first thing, from a kind of human level, do you think she's really recovered from the election?
I doubt she'll ever recover from that election, quite frankly. You know, here is someone who was, for most of her adult life, had been touted as the potential first female president of the United States. Came very, very close, perhaps closer than most people realize, to getting the Democratic nomination in 2008, and was beaten by Barack Obama, someone whose career she had helped bring about in the first place. It was a sense that, well, it was just a matter of time until 8 years later on when she took her place and became president. And to win that election by 3 million votes, and I would remind listeners that she won more votes in that election than any white man in US history. The only candidate ever to get more votes than she did was Barack Obama in 2008. To do all that and to lose to, of all people, Donald Trump, I think is something which nobody, I think, would ever get over. And she's doing her best, and she's written this book, What Happened, trying to detail her view on this. But I think she'll take it to her grave that she had this in her grasp and, frankly, blew it.
Do you think people are slowly coming around to Hillary Clinton? Because I think in the build-up to the election, everyone would kind of sum up the US election as two bad candidates, essentially, and one's worse than the other. I know that's a fairly simple, very simplistic view of looking at it, but do you think people now are thinking, oh, right, we probably should have voted for her?
I'm not sure they're thinking, oh, right. I think they might be thinking, oh, something else, we should have voted for her. It's remarkable, frankly, the way in which all of her career, Hillary Clinton has been defamed and defined by her enemies far better than she has been characterized by her supporters. I think it comes back to the classic old thing about women in public life and women in politics, and they used to be called witches and now they're called bitches. And we're seeing a lot of that in regards to things that are happening in Westminster at the moment. And I think Hillary Clinton, much as her husband was a generation before, they were at the vanguard of their generation. He had to deal with an awful lot because he was the third youngest American president in history, the first baby boomer president. She was the first credible female candidate, and she had to take a lot of flack, which will hopefully make it easier for the next generation of women coming through. But where that's coming from at this point is anybody's guess.
Do you think that's her done in politics now? Obviously, she's written the new book. There are a few kind of people speaking recently saying there could be a potential run from her, but do you think that's it?
Let's be very honest about it. I mean, she's in her early 70s. 4 years from now, she would be in her mid-70s. At the end of her first term, that would make her 80. I mean, it's just unrealistic, quite frankly. What is shocking, frankly, about American politics is the dearth of any other candidates coming through. All through 2015 and 16, many people said, well, why Hillary? Surely it's time for someone else. But there simply is a lack of credible candidates in their 40s or 50s coming along to challenge for the party leadership. You know, most of the senior politicians in the United States at the moment, from the president, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Sanders, McCain, they're all in their 70s. You know, if you're a young college student in the United States, it must be very depressing to look around and say, well, where's someone representing our generation? Because frankly, there isn't anybody.
Are there any names that would stand out for you, not just for Democrats or Republicans, of upcoming politicians, maybe not presidents in the next 4 years, but I know people like Elizabeth Warren are heavily spoken about, but again, are there any names that kind of jump that we can expect to be big players in US politics?
See, this is the problem. I mean, people talk about Elizabeth Warren, and she's a fine member of Congress. This is the woman that gained notoriety because she claimed Native American heritage, leading to Donald Trump calling her Pocahontas in a terribly derogatory fashion. But guess what? You know, she's of a similar age to the other candidates we've just spoken about. There really is a total lack of credible, young, dynamic candidates, frankly, coming through at any level. The fact that I can't throw names at you is not a lack of understanding on my account. There just simply isn't anybody that I would say, yes, this is someone to really, really watch coming forward. It is a terribly depressing time in American politics. And I say that as someone who has followed it my entire life. And there's always been someone coming along that was worth, following. It just isn't at the moment. It's really, really awful.
In the other players in that election, I want to kind of, because Bernie Sanders was someone who gained a lot of traction. What's he been doing since the election? Is he very vocal against Trump? Because I think a lot of people on this side of the pond sort of saw him being very vocal during the election, but since then has kind of shut up.
What's he done? He's gone back to doing what he did. He's left the Democratic Party and re-registered as an independent, as he always has been. And he's getting as much free airtime as possible on CNN, criticising Donald Trump, but frankly, he's going nowhere. Again, he's in his 70s. He is certainly not representative of the future direction in American politics. He is in many ways the Jeremy Corbyn of the US. He's someone who is reminding Americans of what the party of the left used to be like before the Blair-Clinton operation came along and took the Democratic Party and the Labour Party into the sort of the centre ground of British and American politics and made them electable to Middle America and Middle England. And Sanders and Corbyn, I think, have tried their best to remind the electorate that that's not where the left-wing parties of those two countries used to be. And we'll see how successful that is on both sides of the pond in the coming years, I guess.
Moving on to Barack Obama, obviously presidents have legacies when it comes to foreign policy. George Bush will forever be known for the Iraq War. Does Obama have a clear legacy, would you say, on foreign policy? Was he unfairly treated for the drone strikes, for being labelled as kind of hawkish?
I don't think it's unfair. I think you have to treat every president on their record. He set the bar of expectations unbelievably high. Change we can believe in. Many people would suggest there wasn't a great amount of change. A lot of people said in his first term, well, it was a continuation, a third term of George W. Bush. I think it's very easy to run against an incumbent and to promise radical change and reform. And then what happens is you become president and you realize, well, the reason that things were happening is because there was, great pressure for that to happen. He took the drone policy, which does not begin under George W. Bush, but arguably under Bill Clinton, which is something I'm here to talk about today, weaponized it, took it to the obvious extent that it was achievable to get to, and obviously did that in an effort to reduce American casualties. And obviously there was a detrimental impact from that for citizens in a whole variety of countries where they were deployed.
And before we move on to Bill Clinton, JFK files, John Kennedy, they're coming out in the next, well, I think they're out, some of them are out, but there's some that are still to be released. Are we going to find out anything particularly revealing, or do you think that it's going to be a bit of a disappointment?
So, the release of this material was actually authorised 25 years ago.
Right.
In the aftermath of the Oliver Stone movie JFK. That movie generated so much pressure on the American government to get these files out that President George H.W. Bush signed some legislation, effectively the JFK Records Assassination Act, which said that 25 years from that point, i.e. now, these files had to be released, unless the sitting American president refused to release them for some reasons of national security. That was why Donald Trump got involved with this, because it was initially suggested that he was going to withhold these materials. He came out and said, no, I'm going to get these things out there. At the very last minute, the CIA and the FBI asked for a stay on some files because they were referring to potentially ongoing operations and live agents. So there is a whole host of documents which we were expecting to come out last week, which will now be apparently released within the coming 6 months once they have been redacted and make sure that sensitive data has been removed. They have, of course, had 25 years to work on that. You would have thought that they could have done this ahead of time. It's the sort of thing that anybody who's expecting a smoking gun is going to be disappointed. But if you know the stuff and have read the stuff and are a scholar of the assassination, you will find data, I'm sure, which will reinforce material that has been published previously, but will give extra weight to certain incidents and evidence, which might support your ideas of a conspiracy if you believe it. My feeling with this has always been that what you take from the data depends what you bring to it. So if you believe there was a conspiracy, you will see that within the documentation you see. If, on the other hand, you believe that no, it was one guy with one gun who got lucky, then you'll also see that. So it depends, which aspects of the paperwork you look at, I think.
Okay, now moving on to Bill Clinton and the Clintons more generally. Obviously, you've written about this in the past and you've spoken about this extensively. Your book, Clinton's Grand Strategy, US Foreign Policy in a Post-Cold War World, and obviously Hillary rising last year. Your new book is coming out next year. It's Clinton's War on Terror, US Counterterrorism Strategy from 93 to 2001. Why the focus on the Clintons? Do you find them the most interesting, the most kind of revealing on foreign policy?
So, when I was a young lad growing up just down the road from here in Leamington and then Solihull, I got very interested in the Kennedy administration. When John Kennedy was in the last summer of his life, he welcomed a young group from Arkansas to the White House on Boys Nation, and one of those was a 17-year-old chap called Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton ran for the presidency in 1992 when I was 21, and the Clinton campaign put a fabulous photograph out of Bill Clinton shaking Jack Kennedy's hand with the immortal line, "The torch is passed to a new generation." Clearly, Clinton was attempting to present himself as a Kennedy-esque figure for the 1990s. And that might seem bizarre now to those of you who only think of Bill Clinton and issues to do with scandal and Monica Lewinsky and the denial of inappropriate relations, but there really was a lot of hope for Bill Clinton in the early 90s. I followed his career as a candidate in 92, coming to office in January 93. I worked on Capitol Hill in 1995, met the president when I was working there, and I've been dining out on that photograph ever since, quite frankly. Having met the guy and a lot of his team in Washington when I was working there, I came back, eventually finished my degree and did a PhD at the University of Birmingham into his foreign policy. I've never looked back, really. It's just been an area of history which I believe risks being lost to history, because so many historians will look at the Cold War and they'll look at the subsequent War on Terror. And there's an 8-year gap in between, which is the Clinton years. And I think it's an area that many people will overlook and not understand how important those years were in terms of the linkage between the Cold War and the coming War on Terror. And indeed, my talk today and the book, which is coming out next year, is designed very much to explain the idea that this war on terror does not begin on September 11th, 2001. The United States was at war with terrorist activity and terrorist organizations for many years before that.
I think it's really fascinating because obviously war on terror, the immediate kind of word that springs to mind is George W. Bush, and you argue that it's kind of predated that then.
I'll be honest, it's a contentious title. It's designed to be provocative and to make people sit up and think oh, that's unusual. I would have associated that with W, not with Bill Clinton. One of the things which the book reveals is the muscular approach to combating terrorism that the Clinton administration does adopt. They use rendition. They use what becomes extraordinary rendition. They use drone strikes. They're targeting bin Laden with missile strikes. A lot of the geography and the individuals which we associate with W and the post 9/11 era are already in place 4 years beforehand. And it's not exactly an untold story, but it's an underappreciated story, I think.
And also in those 8 years under Bill Clinton, there were some other aspects of foreign policy which certainly will stick in mind. Things like Kosovo, things like Bill Clinton not intervening in Rwanda. With those two cases in particular, I mean, what are your opinions on them broadly?
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
Well, we need to, if we're going to address them, we need to put them into context. So why doesn't Bill Clinton not go into Rwanda? Well, it's important to remember that he inherited the operation in Somalia. Many people will know through the Ridley Scott movie Black Hawk Down. It's an interesting movie, but it explains nothing of the political environment within which that happened. Bill Clinton's administration inherited it. George H.W. Bush had deployed the troops. Bill Clinton did his best to get those troops out as quick as possible. He responded to a plea from Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to send a special forces group in to try and track down a particularly odious warlord. It was in that operation that the Marines were lost. So having seen the loss of American casualties, 19 in one day, the bloodiest day of battlefield losses in Bill Clinton's presidency, neither he nor the Congress were disposed to then send a whole new contingent of American troops back to the African continent less than a year later. It was also important to remember that, and this sounds terrible, so please recognize this is not my words, but when the Rwanda massacre began, there was a sense in Washington that this is what happens in Africa. Tribes kill one another on a regular basis, on an annual basis. All that happened was that when the ceiling that was expected to be reached from comparable previous massacres had been reached, it continued almost exponentially, and the death rate in Rwanda is remarkably appalling, and more efficient than the Nazis, quite frankly, in terms of how many people were killed in such a short time period. No one expected it, and it is unfortunate that the Americans and Bill Clinton get so much criticism for not intervening, quite frankly, when there was an awful lot of blame to go around at the UN in particular. Neither the administration, nor Congress, nor the media, nor the military were prepared to get involved. Bill Clinton has apologized for it. He's seen it as the gravest mistake of his presidency. But I think if one is to stand back and be impartial about it, there was not the political will, there was not the political opportunity, there certainly wasn't any pressure from within the United States to intervene. I think all too often one can accuse the Americans of either getting involved too often or too little, depending upon where one stands on the situation.
Fair enough. Also, we'll move on to Donald Trump now, because I think it can't be a US foreign policy interview without talking about Donald Trump. Will he be remembered for North Korea, do you think? And what are your kind of views on the situation with North Korea at the minute? Is it just so bizarre that you can't really believe it?
I certainly hope that Donald Trump is not remembered for North Korea, because that will suggest something unbelievably awful happens. A lot of people are comparing the situation in North Korea with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the great difference then was that in John F. Kennedy, we had a leader who had been through the crucible of the Bay of Pigs, who had been seared by that experience and had learned on the job, and who'd surrounded himself with very smart people who arrived at a very smart conclusion and recognized that there was room to develop the policy vis-a-vis Cuba as that crisis developed. My worry with Donald Trump, quite frankly, is that he has not been through the similar test of a Bay of Pigs. He appears to be unwilling or unable to learn from anything, quite frankly, or from anybody. And his bellicose rhetoric, I think, is very, very difficult to comprehend. There are many lessons to take from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Trump appears unwilling or unable to learn any single one of them.
Now, in terms of US politics broadly at the minute, I know you've probably spoken about this extensively, and the Manafort saga, and also, is it Papadopoulos? His because I think whilst the news has reached the UK, a lot of people in the UK don't quite understand or haven't really been told the full information as to what's happened. Is it as grave as is being talked about in the US? Is Donald Trump getting away with it, would you say?
Okay, so there are several lines of inquiry into Donald Trump and, by extension, Russian interference in the presidential election. There are several congressional hearings going on. The most dangerous for the president is being led by Robert Muller. Now, that investigation only occurred because Donald Trump fired Jim Comey, the director of the FBI. As a result of that, The Deputy Attorney General appointed Robert Muller to act as an investigator into this process. He has been, over the last couple of months, convening a grand jury to consider charges against a whole variety of individuals. He has been interviewing senior members of the Trump administration, right up to the very, very top levels of the White House. What we have seen in the last couple of days is Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, arraigned, charged, and now under house arrest on the basis of conspiring against the United States, money laundering, failing to register as a foreign agent of a government power, i.e. Ukraine, and a host of other situations. He's co-charged with his business partner. Alongside that, Papadopoulos has also been charged. This is a guy who was a foreign policy advisor to the campaign and appears to have been acting as a middleman between a variety of key individuals on the Trump campaign and Russian interests, particularly here in the United Kingdom and in London. He is now pled guilty to misleading the FBI and federal investigators, and therefore is singing like a bird, talking about what's going on. What Mueller's ambition here is to charge lower level individuals, threaten them with a great amount of prison time, effectively, in the hope that they will then cop a plea and start talking about people further up the food chain. And that is the great risk to Donald Trump's presidency, that slowly, just as with Watergate, lower level individuals start naming the higher ups, and sooner or later the net tightens to a point where the only person left standing is Donald Trump. And at which point it's his word against everybody else's. And then we're into an entirely new world.
And just finally, while we've got you here, James, got to ask you, obviously, this is not the only incident that's happened under the Trump administration. There seems to be people coming and going every single week. Can he last as president, or is there a serious danger he could be impeached?
Donald Trump will only be impeached, in my opinion, if the Democrats win the midterm elections in 2018 and therefore control the House and the Senate. I would also point out that the impeachment process in the US has only been implemented twice, once in the 1860s and once in the 1990s. And on both counts, the president survived a vote in the Senate. Nixon, of course, was facing impeachment and quit once he realized that the numbers weren't there and he would lose that impeachment process. The impeachment process is a political process. Even if Donald Trump were impeached and was removed from office, that still only leaves you with Mike Pence as the American president. People who I think maybe people will think, well, if we just get rid of Trump, that gives us Hillary. And that simply isn't the case. So getting rid of Donald Trump doesn't solve anything from the point of view of trying to bring sense and sensibility, dare I say, back to the White House.
Well, James, obviously people will know you from their TV screens. You're on Al Jazeera, you're on BBC, you're on just about everything. How can people stay up to date with your work on Twitter? And so you're on Twitter, obviously.
I am on Twitter, and that's at James D. Boys. I've got a website, which is at jamesdboys.com, and I always welcome any interaction. Anybody wants to get hold of me, quite frankly, I would be delighted to hear from anybody, and I certainly wish those students out there at University of Warwick the very, very best with their studies and endeavours.
James, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.